Sometime in the last week, you ate a fish you didn't catch, maybe a filet-o-fish at 11 p.m., maybe shrimp on a Tuesday because it was on sale, maybe a $34 piece of halibut at a restaurant where the waiter said the word seasonal a little too proudly. And you didn't think about it. Nobody does. You looked at the price, decided it was fine, ate it, moved on. But between that fish and your plate, there was a boat, and that boat is one of the strangest businesses in America. An asset that rots in salt water, a crew that legally isn't employed, a commodity input it can't control, sold into a commodity market it can't control. And this broke my brain the first time I saw the numbers. The most valuable thing in the whole operation isn't the boat at all. I'm going to say something that sounds insane, then spend 17 minutes proving it. A fishing trawler is not a business that catches fish. A fishing trawler is a machine that converts diesel into protein, and the person who owns it isn't really a fisherman. They're running a leveraged spread trade between two prices they have no say over: the price of fuel and the price of fish. That's the whole business. Everything else is weather. Let's start where every bad investment starts: the listing. Picture this. You're scrolling a commercial boat brokerage at 1 a.m., which is a real hobby I have, and I'm not proud of it. And you see a 61-foot steel trawler, a freezer hold. Solid engine, asking price, 300 grand, $300,000. That's a 2-bedroom condo in a city nobody wants to live in. And your brain does the thing brains do. Wait, I could own a boat that makes money? Here's the trap. That number, the 300 grand, that's the steel. That's the hull, the engine, the winches, the wheelhouse. That's the part that floats. The part that lets you fish, completely separate, costs more, sometimes way more. Which brings me to Danny. I met Danny Voss in New Bedford, Massachusetts about 9 years ago. I was doing diligence on a seafood processor for a client. Danny was a vessel manager, the guy who runs boats for owners who don't want to be on boats. 50s, forearms, like bridge cable, drank coffee that had been on the burner since the Clinton administration. I asked what his boat was worth. He said, "Which part?" "What do you mean, which part?" He said, "The boat's worth maybe 800. The permit's worth more than the boat. And the permit is a piece of paper in a filing cabinet in a federal office building that has never once been to sea." That's the first thing to understand. In American commercial fishing, you're not buying capital equipment. You're buying access rights. The steel is cheap. The permission is expensive. And New Bedford is the place to see at highest value fishing port in the United States for 23 straight years. Not the most fish, the most money. In a good year, that port lands well over $400 million of seafood, and around 84% of that value is scallops alone. One town, one shellfish. So why isn't everybody doing it? Because of the first half of the spread: diesel. Here's a number that should be more famous than it is. A large offshore shrimp boat in the Gulf, going out for a 30-day trip, burns between 9,000 and 12,000 gallons of diesel. Not per year, per trip. And you pay for all of it before you leave the dock. Every gallon. Up front. Before you know if there are shrimp. Before you know what they'll sell for when you get back. Before you know if a storm eats week 2, which is where Ray comes in. Ray Guidry, very Louisiana name, pronounced G-I-D-R-E, ran a shrimp boat out of Plaquemines Parish. I met him through a friend doing agricultural lending down there. Ray kept his fuel receipts in a shoebox. Not a folder, a shoebox. And he'd pull one out to make a point the way other people pull out a photo of their kids. He handed me one and said, "That's my whole season in one piece of paper." And that's genuinely what it is. In the last couple of years, Gulf shrimpers watched diesel go from around $3.50 a gallon to over $5 in about 3 months. One operator in Coden, Alabama, reported spending $47,000 on fuel for a single trip, $20,000 more than the same trip cost the year before. 20 grand. Same boat, same nets, same fish, nothing changed, except a number on a screen in a commodities market 8,000 miles away. Finance hat on, because this is the part that matters. Most businesses, when input costs rise, Do a thing called passing it through. The coffee shop makes the latte $7. The airline adds a fuel surcharge. Your landlord, you know what your landlord does. A trawler owner cannot do that. Not even a little. Because when he ties up with 40,000 pounds of shrimp, he doesn't set the price. The buyer does. And the buyer is staring at a global market flooded with farm-raised imported shrimp that costs a fraction to produce. So the cost side is volatile and rising, and the revenue side is set by somebody else. In any other industry, we'd call that an unhedgeable short position. In fishing, we call it Tuesday. Ray put it simpler. I'm buying diesel retail and selling shrimp wholesale, and everybody between me and your dinner plate gets paid before I do. He wasn't wrong. He also wasn't fishing that season. He was driving a crew boat out to oil platforms instead, because the math didn't work. Now the selling side. Because most people assume that if fish is expensive at the restaurant, the fisherman is doing fine. That gap is one of the widest in the American economy. Adjusted for inflation, dockside shrimp prices in the Gulf have fallen from over $6 a pound 40 years ago to under $2. Gulf shrimp revenue got cut by more than half between 2021 and 2023, from $489 million down to $221. Meanwhile, has shrimp gotten cheaper at your grocery store? Be honest. That's not a conspiracy. That's what happens when you're the most fragmented link in a supply chain. Thousands of independent boats, all landing perishable inventory, all needing cash today, all selling to a much smaller number of buyers. I learned this properly from Marisol Ferreira, who worked the buying side at a seafood house. The people who show up when the boat ties up and tell you what your trip is worth. I asked her once, kind of naively, "How do you decide the price?" She laughed at me, not meanly, the way you laugh at a nephew who asks why the ocean doesn't run out. She said, "I don't decide it. The market decides it. I just deliver the news." And here's the ugly part. I know exactly how much fuel he burned to get here, and it doesn't move my number by a penny. His costs aren't my problem. His fish is my inventory. His costs aren't my problem. That sentence has stayed with me for a decade. That's price-taking in its purest form. It's why fishing is one of the only industries where you can have a phenomenal harvest and a catastrophic year at the same time. If everybody has a great harvest, the price collapses, and the good year kills you. Farmers know that feeling. Oil producers know that feeling. Oldest curse in commodities. The cure for high prices is high prices. Now, here's my favorite part of this entire business, and it's the part that turns a fishing boat from a blue-collar story into a finance story. Remember Danny's line? The permit is worth more than the boat? Let me show you what that actually looks like with real numbers. Up in Alaska, halibut and sablefish run under an IFQ program, individual fishing quota, largest catch share program in the country. Instead of a free-for-all where everyone races to catch as much as possible before the season slams shut, the government hands out permanent shares. You own a percentage. Every year, that percentage converts into pounds you're allowed to land. You now own, essentially, a perpetual royalty on a wild animal population. And these trade. There's a brokerage market. You can go look at the listings tonight. So here's the number. Recently, halibut quota in some Alaska areas has been changing hands around $37 to $40 a pound. Think about that. $37 to buy the right to catch 1 pound of halibut once a year, forever. And what does that pound fetch at the dock? Single digits. Often somewhere around $7 or $8. So you're paying roughly 5 times annual gross revenue to own the right to earn that revenue, before fuel, before crew, before bait, ice, insurance, or the engine rebuild you're pretending isn't coming. If you've ever looked at a commercial real estate deal, that should feel familiar. That's a cap rate. That's exactly how you'd price an apartment building. Because that's what it is. Quota isn't equipment. Quota is land. Invisible, floating, federally issued ocean real estate. And here's the thing about land. You don't have to work it. You can rent it. Which brings me to Ken. Ken Halverson fished out of Sitka for 31 years. Longliner, got his quota shares in the 90s when the program started essentially for free, allocated on fishing history. When I met him, he was 68, living in a house with very good heating, and he hadn't been on a boat in 6 years. He leased his fish out. Younger guys with boats and no paper paid him for the right to catch his pounds. He took a cut off the top. They took all the risk, fuel, weather, crew, 20-hour days. I asked if that felt strange. Going from fisherman to landlord. He thought about it a while. Then, I spent 30 years being the guy who took the risk. Now I'm the guy who prices it. I sleep better and I make about the same. That's the whole story of what catch shares did to American fishing. It turned a hunting economy into a rental economy. Whether that's good or bad depends entirely on which side of that transaction you were born on. Let's talk crew. If you've been thinking, okay, but at least labor is a manageable cost. No, labor doesn't work like that out here. Commercial fishing crews mostly don't earn wages. They earn shares. Typically, the boat lands the catch, sells it, and that gross number goes on a settlement sheet. Subtract trip expenses, fuel, ice, bait, groceries, offload. What's left is the net, and the net gets split. Boat takes a chunk, captain takes a chunk, deckhands split the rest at a percentage everybody agreed to before the lines came off the dock. Great trip, everyone eats. Disaster trip, everyone starves. Together. Now pause. Because from a pure finance perspective, this is elegant. It converts the single largest labor cost from fixed to fully variable. No payroll when the boat sits idle. No severance. No obligation when the season closes. In a business with revenue this volatile, that's not exploitation by design, it's survival by design. A fixed-wage trawler goes bankrupt in one bad season. But you should hear what it feels like from the other side. Tyler Boudreau was a deckhand I met in a bar in Kodiak. I was there for a client, he was there because he'd just finished a trip, and the whole town has approximately one thing to do. 24 years old. Showed me his settlement sheet on his phone like a bad report card. Line by line, gross, minus fuel, minus grub, minus offload, then his slice of what was left. He said, I worked 19 hours a day for 11 days and got paid a percentage of somebody else's leftovers. And then I think about this a lot, he said, but last September I made 11 grand in 9 days, so I'll be back. That's the hook, holding that entire labor force in place. It's not a salary, it's a lottery ticket you have to bleed for. And the upside is real often enough that people keep buying the ticket. Worth knowing too, because they're paid in shares, crew are usually treated as self-employed. They get a $1,099. No withholding, no benefits, and a very unpleasant April for a lot of very young men. Here's the cost nobody thinks about until they own one. A trawler is a steel object living permanently in salt water, and salt water's entire personality is destroying steel. It's not a truck that slowly wears out. It's a building that's on fire at a low, manageable rate, forever. Haul-outs, zinc anodes, shaft seals, hydraulics, refrigeration, nets, electronics, because everything on a boat dies. And then the big one, an engine rebuild, or a repower, which on a mid-size hull runs well into 6 figures. I once sat with an accountant named Arlene Soa, who kept books for about a dozen boats in a northeast port. She had a rule she gave every new owner like a warning. Budget maintenance as a percentage of what the boat is worth, not what it earns. The boat decays on its own schedule. It doesn't check whether you had a good year. Then insurance, hull coverage, plus protection and indemnity for the crew. And this is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. So those premiums are not gentle. And here's the twist that makes it worse. For a lot of these boats, the binding constraint isn't the ocean, it's the calendar. In New Bedford, the scallop fleet has been so squeezed by quota cuts and days at sea limits that vessels have been sitting tied to the dock something like 11 months out of the year. Multi-million-dollar assets rusting stern to stern along the pier. One owner up there put it in a way any finance person feels in their spine. You wouldn't dare keep a plane grounded for 300 days. Boats are no different. He's right, and it's worse than an idle plane. An idle plane sits in dry desert air. An idle boat sits in the thing that's eating it. That's why there's a live fight over letting owners stack 2 permits onto one hull, so one boat fishes twice the days instead of 2 boats each fishing half a year. It's a utilization argument, functionally identical to merging 2 half-empty warehouses into one full one. Just wetter, and with more people whose grandfathers did this. All right, let's total it up honestly. Say you buy a mid-sized trawler, $750,000 for hull and gear. Now the paper permits or quota, which depending on the fishery can match the boat or dwarf it. Call it another $1 million, financed. Every year you're servicing debt on both, buying fuel at whatever the market says today, paying observer and cost recovery fees, paying insurance that reprices after every bad year in the fleet, paying maintenance on a rotting steel object, and your revenue is set entirely by a buyer whose relationship to your cost structure is, and I quote, "not my problem." Who does that structure suit? Somebody with scale, which is exactly what happened. In New Bedford, scalloping consolidated into companies running fleets of 20-plus vessels with hired captains and hired crews. In Alaska, the pollock fishery, the biggest in the country by volume, got restructured in 1998 under the American Fisheries Act into cooperatives. And the at-sea catcher processor sector ended up as a handful of vessels owned by a handful of companies. 300-foot floating factories that catch, fillet, freeze, and package at sea, turning out hundreds of thousands of pounds of finished product a day. That's not a boat. That's a manufacturing plant that sources its own raw material. Last one, Peter Nakashima, who I met at a maritime finance conference in Seattle. Terrible coffee, extremely good information. He invested in fishing assets professionally. I asked the obvious question, what do you actually look for? He said, I don't buy boats. Boats are a liability I tolerate. I buy quota and I buy processing. Harvesting is the worst business in the chain. Highest capex, highest risk, lowest margin, and the only link where a hurricane can zero you out. Then he said the line I've repeated in probably 4 meetings since. The fish are free. Everything expensive happens after the fish is dead. That's the whole industry in one sentence. So here's where I land. A fishing trawler looks like the last honest business in America. One guy, one boat, one ocean, no boss. And there's something in that worth protecting. Louisiana had nearly 20,000 shrimpers in the mid-1980s. Today it's under 1,500. That's not consolidation. That's an extinction event with a spreadsheet behind it. But financially, it's one of the most punishing structures I've ever modeled. Volatile input you can't hedge. Volatile output you can't price. An asset that decays whether you use it or not. A permission slip that costs more than the equipment. And a labor model that only works because the crew accepts the same variance the owner does. And yet the value is real. Enormous. It just collects at the 2 ends in the paper and in the processing, and almost none of it collects in the middle, where the boat is, where the work is, where the danger is. So next time you're at the fish counter doing the mental math on whether it's worth $12 a pound, it is. It's just that almost none of that $12 reaches the person who went out and got it. Now, I want to hear from you. What business should I take apart next? Drop it in the comments if enough of you say the same thing. That's the next video, and I do read all of them. And if you've actually worked on a boat, get in there, because the crew share stories are always better than anything I can pull out of a filing. I'll see you in the next one.